Hello, my name is Pei Zhang. I'm going to walk you through some basics in medical translation during this course. I grew up in mainland China and later studied and worked in Japan, France, Germany, and the States. Apart from medicine and science, I'm also interested in languages. I've always worked part-time as a medical translator or interpreter. Now, I'm a national board certified medical interpreter in Mandarin, and I'm honored to work for Meteor because I think Dr. Li and my colleagues are truly contributing to something great. I believe medical translation and interpretation can tremendously enhance effective communication and help those in need. And I hope by sharing my experiences with you, we can learn things from each other and improve our skills together. So this is our first presentation for Unit 1, and we'll be covering the historical overview of medical translation. I'll be reading out of the Translation Practices Explained, Medical Translations Step by Step, Learning by Drafting, written by Vincent Resorricio and Maria Gonzalez Davis. For an overview, we find that grasping the relevance of translation through history is a way of enhancing self-awareness and identity as a professional translator. Medical translation has some characteristic features that translators should be aware of. So, an overview of the working process provides a clear idea of what happens in a real professional context. Knowing how the medical translation market works helps translators to find the right professional niche. And also, the contact with all the translators provides insight into how the profession flows. So for a historical overview of medical translation, we find that translation has probably existed in some form or other ever since human beings felt the need to communicate with other groups of their own kind. Probably the oldest forms of translation involved trade. We find one of the most remote references to written translation in the cities of ancient Mesopotamia, where medical, chemical, mathematical, and astrological knowledge was gathered, organized, and stored in cuneiform symbols written on clay tablets, some of which contained information in different languages such as Ugaritic, Akkadian, Sumerian, Hittite, and Hurrian. These archaeological findings suggest an intense translation activity long before paper and the alphabet were invented. Much later, in the 5th century BCE, Hippocrates, author of one of the oldest volumes on medicine that exist, the Corpus Hippocraticum, written about 400 BCE, inherited a vast amount of knowledge from previous civilizations, and founded a school of medicine where he produced works on anatomy, physiology, pathology, hygiene, and medical ethics with the collaboration of other scholars. Later, Alexandria, founded by the Greeks in Egypt, became a melting pot for people and ideas, languages, and cultures from the Mediterranean lands, the East, and India. We know that its museum and library contained works on anatomical dissections and physiological experiments. Its zoological garden had collections of animals which were classified by scholars and which would have provided opportunities for veterinary research and the study of animal husbandry. Medicinal and other plants in the extensive botanic gardens were similarly classified, and their properties were no doubt investigated, both for medical and culinary purposes. 100 years or so later, the Greek city of Pergamon in Asia Minor became another important center of scholarship and one which produced Galen, one of the most famous exponents of Greek medical knowledge. He was a prolific author, writing some 400 works based on the Hippocratic tradition. In the 9th century, much of his work were translated into Arabic at the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. These translations, in turn, were translated into Latin in the 11th century, together with commentaries added by other Arab scholars in the intervening years. Thanks to the translation activity carried out at the House of Wisdom, the Arabs assimilated the Greek medical legacy and started to produce original works, which contributed to the advance of medical knowledge. In Spain, the School of Toledo arose from collaboration between Islamic, Christian, and Jewish scholars. Works by Aristotle, Archimedes, Pythagoras, and Hippocrates were translated and commented upon by physicians such as Ibn Rushd, known as Averroes, Maimonides, and Ibn Sina or Avicenna, the author of Canon Medicae, a medical textbook still used in the 18th century. King Alphonse X of Castile introduced translations into Romance Castilian and other emerging European languages at a time when the use of vernacular languages were increasing. In England, King Alfred the Great, 2 centuries or so earlier, had promoted education and the arts. He himself translated books from Latin into Anglo-Saxon and ordered translations into that language. During the Middle Ages, knowledge of medicine and related fields were preserved in monastic libraries, and medicine was produced and largely dispensed by monks, who based many of their medicinal remedies on the accumulated wisdom handed down through the centuries via translations. The continuum of medical knowledge clearly stretches back into prehistoric times. So far, we have said nothing about how these early works were translated. Were they literal translations, or were they fairly free and selective adaptations? This dichotomy between strictly literal and freely adapted translations was in fact mentioned by Cicero, whose defense of translating non verbum de verbo sed sensum experimere de sensu, not word for word but sense for sense, was expounded in his work De Optimo Genere Oratorum, 46 BCE. His division has carried over into discussions about translation to the present day. That translation mattered in ancient Rome is testified to by the fact that the Emperor Augustus employed translators on a regular basis. Medicine was a highly respected discipline at that time, and medical translators abounded, working mostly from Greek into Latin. They favored a literal approach to translation, at odds with that of Cicero, whose freer approach was favored by medieval translators. In the Middle Ages, this literal view of translation was defended by philosophers and theologians such as Boethius. Since the Bible was considered to be God's direct revelation to humanity, it was unacceptable to move away from his word towards what might be considered an interpretation. St. Jerome's double approach in his Vulgate reflected this dilemma. He defended the classical rhetorical sense-for-sense approach to translation, but found himself trying to balance it with what he called veritas, the truth in the source text, in order to avoid the risk of being accused of heresy. In the Renaissance, with Latin as the lingua franca, 2 kinds of translations were carried out, between vernacular languages in Latin and between the vernacular languages themselves. The inclusion of vernacular glosses in Latin translations and the rise of vernacular literatures in the 10th century, together with the invention of printing in the 15th century, brought about great changes for translation and its status. Trade and artistic exchanges called for either a lingua franca or for a greater emphasis on translation. The growing political importance of vernacular languages, symbolizing the rise of nation-states, tipped the scale favorably for translation. Translation of the Bible also represented a milestone in the consolidation of vernacular languages. The need for lingua franca became acute in the 17th century, especially when scientists hoped for a wide distribution of their work. Many translated their works into Latin in order to make them accessible to a wider readership. However, many such works were then plagiarized. Robert Boyle, for instance, was a victim of this type of intellectual theft and finally arranged with Oxford presses for his works to be published in vernacular English and in Latin simultaneously. Others, such as Hobbes and Newton, followed his example. Most scientists controlled the translations of their work. Descartes' translator was his friend, the Duc de Luynes, and Newton's was his pupil, Samuel Clarke. Translation into Latin on scientific topics died out around 1750. 200 years later, since the middle of 20th century, communicative and functional approaches to translation have made headway in translation studies and are especially useful for medical translation. They relate languages to their context and underline the importance of the real-world circumstances under which utterances acquire their meaning and should be interpreted, and point out how the translator's choices are conditioned by the client. The fact that over the last 2 centuries, English has become the new lingua franca of distribution does not necessarily mean that it is the only language of production. biomedical researchers all over the world writing in many different languages, trying to get their work accepted by international journals, published in English through translations. Legal requirements for documentation of medicinal products in the European Union, as well as the general trend towards internationalization, have also increased the need for translation. In addition, there are bilingual editions of medical journals, along with monolingual publications in all languages. Thus, the existence of a lingua franca does not necessarily reduce the amount of translation. Most professional translation in the field of medicine or related areas involves English, either as a source language or as a target language. It is difficult to ascertain the actual percentage of medical translations, including all genres, such as research articles, patient information leaflets, advertisement, and so forth, carried out in most countries. But in the case of medical books in Spain, for instance, the information can be easily accessed at the website of Ministerio de Cultura. It states that 26% of books published yearly are translations, of which about 10% are medical or scientific. Knowing something about the history of medical translation and about the differing views on translating that have existed at given historical moments is no frill, for it can help us to understand our position in the professional world better, to be aware of different translation strategies and the functions translations have fulfilled at different stages, to be critical and analytical while considering alternatives, and to learn to justify our choices and argue in an informed way about them. It may also help us to understand better different ways of thinking, writing, and arguing, and to build bridges between scientists, physicians, students, patients, and the general public from different cultures. The alternative is to work routinely and inflexibly in a void with no awareness of the history of the profession. In order to avoid that type of situation, most university medical programs include courses on the history of medicine. By being aware of our history, translators can become part of this fascinating activity, laying to rest once and for all the infamous and untrue traductora traditora, and assuming our true role as active agents in the areas of thought and science.